Now let's get to routing again a little bit and have some fun. Inputs. You notice by default, people are like, hey, the X32 has 1-to-1. Yeah, that's via user. By default, it's still blocks of 8. People ask me all the time, why is it still blocks of 8? It's a physical hardware limitation of how the processor in the console works. There is not a way around that. They somehow got a way around it with the soft patching with his user. The way that works is to the console's processor, it's still blocks of 8, so it's still happy. We're just telling it digitally what each of those channel by channel in the block of 8 can be. But to the console's hardware itself, it's still blocks of 8, always has been, always will be until we get a major change. So here we're going to talk about the different sections that they mean. Local. That is the XLR inputs on the back of your console. Again, 32 for full size, 16 for the compact and the rack. AES-A is your A port. And this is where I was talking about that stipulation. Yes, AES is 48 channels. The most you could possibly control at once is 36, not 48. You have 32 channels, and if you look at your auxes, you have 6 auxes, which is 38 channels, not 48. Behringer calls it a 40 input console. They did that because of 7 and 8, which is the USB recorder playback function in the board. It's a little cheat. Behringer's not the only one. So full mix capability on the console, 38 channels. Remember that.
And I want to intervene here a little bit on that USB. If you're trying to use it for playback and your timing gets off, which more than likely it will be, you're going to find latency, coming through on those two particular inputs, and it's going to drive you absolutely crazy. You're not going to be able to figure out why, and it's because of using that USB input, 7 and 8 for your aux.
Yeah, and that's another good point. 7 and 8, yes, you can change it, like I said, with the config, but still, you only have 36 choices. That's 38, sorry. 38. You notice I got 1 to 32, and I still only have 6 auxes. Again, 38 input channels is the cap of the console. That is it. Don't get confused about why it says 48. That is just what AES itself is capable of. 36 channels is what you got. The other thing to know about the USB that Dana was just talking about is, yeah, the console is pretty good when it comes to recording about not having latency, but when it plays back, it can have some issues. So for like intro music, house music, stuff like that, you're perfectly fine using it. But do not try to use it for playing back backing tracks for your band.
Exactly.
Go to a USB interface plugged into one of your physical input jacks. Plus, not only that, if your band decides to not follow the backing track precisely and wants to shift it up and change to another part of the song or just kill the track, you're not having to figure out a really good communication method between your music director on stage and you at front of house to kill that or stop it. Have your track playback done by someone in the band. It is better for everyone. Now, so that's local, AES, A and B, it's the same thing, 36 max. Now, you're probably wondering, why would it still be 48 if it's only 36? Again, AES is at 48 kilohertz is double what it is in the pro world. The other reason is this. You see something right here called Aux In Remap. By default, it is your aux ins. You can choose local 1 through 6, which if you're using all local inputs, leave it to aux ins. There's no other reason to change it. However, if you are using AES, we'll show this later in the dual console setup, instead of, say, your inputs being normal, a 1-to-1 setup, if you have 32 channels being sent from one console to another, say front of house to broadcast, Sometimes you'll also want to get your local aux ins that front of house sees, house music, Spotify, Propositor, whatever. You're going to want to get those to live stream somehow. What you would then do is all of these get bumped by a block of 8. And then aux ins, you would then choose AES 1 through 6. So then block 1 in the AES chain could be carrying your aux ins from front of house to your broadcast console. That's where having 48 channels in AES really comes in handy, especially in dual consoles. That's where it's really handy. But for just inputs, 38 channel cap. Remember that. 32 full channels, 6 auxes. Speaking of that, I'll mention this real fast. If you do use auxes as normal inputs, there is a big gotcha you have to pay attention to. If you look at gate, you lose the gate and dynamic section on aux inputs. That is exclusive to channels 1 to 32. There's another big gotcha you got to pay attention to. This will not be bad for everyone, but for some people, pay attention. The parametric EQ. You get full 4-band parametric. And an aux, you still do, but if you look at some of these modes, some modes vanish. They've brought a lot of it back in recent firmware updates, so this is not always 100% true. That's what I'm saying. It will massively depend on your firmware. If you are on firmware 4.06 or newer, which is the current, 4.06 and 4.08 are the most recent, what I just said is not applicable to you. You will have all your options in the 4-band parametric for auxes. But dynamic and gate is gone completely on aux channels, any firmware update. So be note of that if you are going to try to use your auxes as input channels, you don't have dynamic control, which for some cases can be a gotcha that you don't want. So be careful of that. And then routing, we got that AESA. And then you have options for card. The card option is the USB card by default on the back of the console. There is other cards you can get. The most popular one a lot of people get is a Dante card, which allows you to send 32 channels from the board out onto a Dante network for broadcast mix or linking to other consoles that use Dante exclusively or predominantly, like Yamaha, just an example. Then you have your user in section, where if you need to do some specific routing and you need one-to-one, you would do user ins. That is how you get one-to-one that has been advertised with the X32. People still see this block of 8 and they're like, I thought it was one-to-one. It's via user in. That's how you do it. Then we got your AES outs again. A port, whatever you're doing. So I changed this earlier for just show. Let's B out. A out is up here. So you got, this is how you remember it. This column is your outputs. Everything along the top is your source. That is how you read these menus in Xedit, by the way. So here in AES-A, unless you're doing some kind of crazy stuff we'll talk about later, by default, leave the defaults, which is 1 through 8, 9 through 16 being outs, 1 through 8, 9 through 16. And then 17 to 24 is doubled. And then your alternate is on 33 to 40 and 41 to 48. Leave that as default unless you're doing some special stuff that you know you need to change it. As for your B outputs, which are down here, you're really not going to change these unless we start getting into dual consoles, which we'll talk about later. Why you would want dual consoles? FOH to monitor or FOH to broadcast. And we will talk about that briefly in a bit. And then your card, this is how you select what's going to the expansion card on the back. USB, Dante, there's sound grid if you want to use waves. There's a weird card called ADAT, which mentioning the ADAT port on the back of the console. There's an ADAT card for the X32. Biggest use of why you would want to do that is if you have recording devices, like preamps that you've collected over the years that you prefer the sound of and you want to use those for inputs. Or the biggest use case is connecting the X32 into a recording environment in a studio. A lot of studio interfaces use ADAT for input output because it's so small and condensed. That's the main purpose of that ADAT card. In a live use, really not all that useful, but it's there. So this is where you select what's going to your card out. So you have local, again, physical XLRs. AES-A, which would typically be your stage boxes. AES-B, if you're using Pro Consoles stage boxes, you're going to have something over here. Again, this should not be an option. You should not be able to route a source to itself, but it's in the routing page for some reason. Then you have out. This is what you assign out on this page. You can assign that. You can assign your alternets. Now, this is where things get confusing that people do not understand the difference between the aux and aux in on card out routing, because only card out routing really has this option. Aux, just normal aux, where it says 1 through 6 plus M. This will be your aux outputs plus your monitor section. Aux in will be aux inputs 1 through 6 and your talkback section. That is the difference between the two auxes. It gets very confusing. The manual does not very specify that, unfortunately. By the way, if you want to change aux outs, it is over here. By default, the 6 auxes are set to insert. I'll talk about why that is later. AES EBU, don't touch it. That's the weird stereo AES connection that's on the back of the consoles. If you're linking into some like other pro recorders or other pro gear, that can be somewhat useful. Like if you have an A10 video switcher, you could still use a single AES XLR cable, not a mic cable. Let me specify that real quick. Do not use a standard XLR mic cable for AES signals. Standard mic cable is 75 ohm resistance. AES is a digital signal similar to DMX. You must have a AES or DMX cable will work, which is 115 ohm resistance. The resistance is much, much higher for the digital signal in AES. Do not use a standard mic cable. It will give you issues. That is a big gotcha. Back to the card out. That's the aux ins, user outs. So user in, we talked about you can do one-to-one patching for your inputs if you need to do something custom. I'll explain this real quick. You got different blocks that you can see for local, AES50, card, aux in. Again, this is your input column. This is your source column. That's how it reads out. So say you were doing an interesting thing where you needed the first 2 channels in your system to come from local, but you needed everything else to be split between AES A and B. I'll give a brief example. So we'll do this. 1, 2, you see it says local in. We'll then move this block over here. I can then choose to do 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can then move down 1 block and get 9, 10, all the way down. And this is where things are going to get funky if you're doing like the DL251s, for example. You would then go over to B and go all the way down. That is the biggest point of user inputs. We can do stuff like that, where now, if you selected this to be user in, which we do, the first 2 inputs that we select will be coming from local. You would then have
now
3 to 8.
Just to clarify this, when you're on that local, you're going to be coming from the console, correct?
The XLR inputs the back of the console.
Yeah, so we haven't got to the stage boxes yet. So for the rack, this is going to be your first 2 XLR inputs.
Correct. For any of the X32s, what I just did here, local. Local, anytime you see local and routing, refers to the console itself.
Correct.
And again, 32 for full size, 16 for compact, and rack. So with this setup that we have, we would have 2 inputs plugged into the console itself. We then have 6 channels coming from the first half of stage box 1. Here's the other half of stage box 1. And then stage box 2. This is if you were running the Pro Series stage boxes, which have to be home run. If we were doing this all regularly with S series or SD series, these 2 blocks, we would move over here to AES-A and have everything go down that way. And that would be your patching. And typically, though, you would actually want to do this, though, and actually go up here. So you notice you have a complete linear line here. So the stage box 1 and 2, you would not use the stage box 1 and 2 since we're using the consoles 1 and 2. You would just put some gaff tape or something over ports 1 and 2 to let people know, don't use those ports. We're pulling from somewhere else. That's how user routing works, for in at least. Output is the exact same thing. But you notice instead of user in, we only have 32, because that's how much the console can typically handle is by default what it wants. It's just 32 channels. You got to get user out, you got 48 now because it knows you may be routing to the AES ports. And you get more options out here. So user in, you only have local 2 AES ports, card, and aux in. User out, we suddenly have aux outs, the Ultranet section, and your 16 assignable outputs, which we already had the local and the EAS. So this is where you would start doing some fancy stuff for like dual console, or if you need to do something weird for, say, you've done the config stuff. And some channels do not match up with their inputs. What you would then do here is if you want it still to be a channel 1-to-1, what's on the console first surface, to say your DAW or your multi-tracking, you can do your offsets in here. So for instance, one church I had some weird routing like that, where their card out, I'll show you how it was weird. We had local 1-2. But then when you went to AES, for the same section, it went up to 17 and 24, and we had 17, 18, 19, 20. And then everything else was normal. So if you have weird configurations like that, just because of how it was wired, and you can't rewire it for now because things happen, you can create offsets to make your config inputs match to your card out. Just make sure card out, you just do boip, 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 boip. Just make sure you choose user outs.
Yeah, because this is always a 2-step process, guys, when you're going to use these user in and user outs. If you're going to use the user in on that input, whatever block you're going to use, you've got to tell it that the local inputs are going to be assigned by the user in. Because a lot of people will jump right over to the user in or user out block, and they will set those up, and they get apps. It's not doing what they want it to do. And,
that's a good point, Dana.
You know, it's just because you didn't tell it to do it.
That's a very good point. Thanks for mentioning that. So yeah, inputs, doesn't matter where you're using a user in or a user out. Once you've selected that, you have to tell it here. It's similar to your outs 1 through 16, by the way. That's another 2-step phase that most people don't read over in the manual. For instance, XLRs. Right now, I have it set to 1 through 16, which on a full size would be all my 16 XLR outs. On a compact or a rack, it'll be 1 through 8. By the way, I'll note this, if you're physically on a console with a rack or a compact, if you have your outputs on XLR set to 9 through 16, 9 through 16, you will see an asterisk on the screen that says no physical output available or selected. That is completely normal. It's just telling you and kind of giving you a heads up, hey, this console only has 8 physical outputs on it. If you want outputs 9 through 16, you're going to need a stage box. That's all that asterisk warning is telling you on those consoles. Be aware of that, though. But yes, like Dana said with user in, user out, if you select them, you then have to then go to user in, user out, and make your changes there. Outputs are the same thing. XLR is 1 through 16. If I actually want to change what the source is, I have to go over here. If I don't, I'll be wondering why my XLR output. So like say someone came in and had done this to a system. And I come in and I'm like, okay, out 1 through 16 is perfectly fine, but I plug in, say, a pair of floor monitors to outputs 1 and 2, and I'm wondering why am I not getting signal? It's because you didn't send a signal to them. There is always check when it comes to routing. It's mostly going to be a 2-step phase. Remember that, 2-step phase. Like inputs. The only time inputs, I'm going to preface this, inputs is where it gets different. The only time it will not be a 2-step phase is if you are choosing the standard options, which is local, AES, any of the AESs, and sometimes card. Sometimes. But if you use user in, it automatically becomes 2-step process. So once you select user in, make sure you go to the user in tab and actually click your routing the way it needs to be. If you don't, you're going to get no signal.
And guys, you need to keep in mind as well, a lot of this, 99% of this, you're going to be able to do with the default routing. It's only when you start getting into these, the options you have with this are just absolutely astronomical. But go back to the inputs, Marshall, and let's just go back to the local in 1 through 8, 9 through 16, and then skip over to the AES50. And I'm doing this for the rack now. Come back over under 1 through 8, down right there. Now, if you're going to set up your card, if you, here again, very, very typical. If you want to set up and have your card record into your DAW, then when you go over and click on your card, you're going to mirror that exact input. And bam, Reaper, whatever DAW you want to use, once you get it set up in, the matrix inside of your digital audio workstation, that's all you have to do right there. And
then one small thing to note about this. I see a lot of people say this when they're doing DAW setups or multi-track recording like we just mentioned. I always see so many times people are like, I'm not getting enough volume into my card. Dana has a video on this on his channel. We'll make sure it's in the comments down below. Please, please, please go watch his video on gain staging. You have to make sure your gain for all your channels is where you're hitting about on the meter bridge, which is right here, the in. Make sure you are hitting at least this -20 mark, around that mark on your input. If you do not, you will be complaining horribly that you do not have enough gain to be used for broadcast or multi-tracking. The gain staging is your first and biggest priority if you're going to be using the card.
Absolutely.
Priority. Generally, it should be your priority to get your gain set correctly.
And that's also going to set your input level into your DAW. This is where this is done. It's absolutely critical, because if you do not do this, you're affecting your signal to noise ratio. You're affecting, if you've got to come in here and start raising and lowering these, you're going to affect the people using in-ear monitors, stage monitors. It's going to affect your gates. It's going to affect your compression. it's going to it's going to affect everything. Number one rule: you set those inputs properly, and then you go through the rest of what you're trying to do.
And off of that, I'm already going to hear people hearing this in comments. Oh, but my amps are too loud. Turn the amps down.
There you go. And I hear it just the same way, brother. I don't have enough volume. I got to raise them higher. No, you need a larger delivery system. You need larger amps, or you need larger speakers.
Yeah, and so many people, going back to the turn your amps down, you almost will never see installed sound systems with the amps and the speakers set at unity or higher. If they are, there is some device between the console, like a DSP engine or something, that is dropping that signal down so these speakers and amps can stay at that happy level. Because yes, some amps, I will say this, some amps prefer to be at unity. They are happier at that. They are more power efficient. If you have one of those amps, get some kind of DSP or something to go in between the outputs of the console and that amp to drop the level a bit to act as an attenuator. You need to have your gains set up properly. If it is too loud afterwards, you need to attenuate it before it goes to the amps. If you don't have the money for a product, let me show that real quick. This is a little off topic, but this is a good point we brought up, Dana. Matrices. I said that it's not just for sending your LR. However, let me go to all so I can get to my main fader. By the way, if you're at Exit and you guys don't know how to get to your main fader and your MC fader, click the all layer. Click the LR, go to sends. I'm going to send this to Matrix 1 and 2 at Unity. If you're doing what I'm about to say, send this at Unity. Yes, I know it says +3 and -3. Get it as close as possible. There we go. Make sure you send it Unity. This is and post fader is a big one. Once we do that, Matrix 1, go to config. Yes, I want a link, so I have a stereo pair. Now what I've done is I now have a second set of faders for my main LR. By default, you should be having your main LR at Unity, 0. If that is overloading your amps, and the amps prefer to be at Unity or sunsetting and it's still too loud, bring the matrix down. That is now going to attenuate the signal going out to the amps. But the rest of the mix in the board, the preamps have now been set correctly. Your LR is now selected correctly at 0. You can just attenuate it down with the matrix. And here's how I recommend setting this if you have to do this. Set it with your band at its loudest moment. And then set this to where it needs to be. And if it ever gets to a soft moment and you need to boost, you can boost any of your channels a little bit higher, or if push comes to shove and you have to, you can push the mains up ever so slightly when it's a soft moment.
Exactly. And that's the whole key to this. It's never one large fader movement. You should be able to do these when all of this is set properly with very minute adjustments to make a very tremendous difference in the volume, the sound pressure levels coming through your, whatever you're doing.
Yeah. So we got that. That's going to be your output routing. So now we got standard routing. One thing we're going to talk about that gets asked a lot if you are doing, say, USB for broadcast.